water is becoming increasingly important in geopolitical spheres. What if the next war isn't fought over geopolitical dominance or ideology? What if the next war is a desperate struggle over water? Water scarcity remains a source of conflict in the modern day. Today, water scarcity is common in some of the world's most politically unstable regions. Water crises are ongoing in Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian countries such as Israel, Egypt, Pakistan, and more. Both the US and the United Nations believe these conflicts will escalate in the future. In a 2012 report, the US Director of National Intelligence's office issues some unsettling predictions. Although the Global Water Security Report states that a water war will be unlikely within the next 10 years, it doesn't stop there. Beyond the 10-year mark, the report estimates that the use of water as a weapon or to further terrorist objectives will also become more likely. Some institutions argue that privatization may be the best way for developing countries to acquire the infrastructure necessary to supply clean water, but this approach has mixed results, leading to social unrest when local populations cannot afford the prices set by private utility companies. While defenders of privatization argue that this is the best way to create the infrastructure, locals and indigenous right groups often accuse the corporations of practicing resource extraction, using water for export purposes, industrial use, or political leverage.
But as we enter a new era combining high technology with the demands of global economic trade, we're entering into a unique stage of history,
in which we know that the world is actually running out of water.
And that wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to be able to happen because we were all taught back in, I don't know, grade 3 or 6 or whatever, that there's a cycle.
When it rains, the water falls from the clouds down all the way to the ground. It soaks into the ground and then the grass and trees grow. Sometimes there's so much water underground that lakes and rivers just pop up, like when you squeeze a box of apple juice. The rivers carry the water back to the ocean. Inside the ocean, the water floats up to the sky as clouds again. Then the wind pushes the clouds towards the land and it rains again. This all happens over and over, forever and ever.
how is our water being polluted?
Each year, an estimated 3.4 million people die from water or sanitation-related causes. Today, most water systems are state-run. This arrangement leaves much to be desired, and more than 1 billion people still lack access to clean water.
Water pollution has been linked to the rising miscarriage rates in women, lower sperm counts in men, and it is so globally severe that the Malaysian government proposed the death penalty for anyone caught contaminating water.
This is the most polluted river in the United States. There's active polio, tuberculosis, hepatitis. Well, we try and reason with the aliens and, you know, tell them what's in the water and try and get them out. None of the agents are going to get in that water to get any of these aliens. They're just contaminated. We have a gate that we deploy across the river down the ways a little bit, and we'll deploy that gate, and then they'll all pretty much go back into Mexico. We already have a battery of shots that we take here at the local hospital. It's about 18 different shots for if any agent falls in that water to keep from contracting something.
What we saw today was a river of human sewage. The water smells like nothing you could ever imagine, as much as 25,000 liters per second flow.
Pasan los desechos de los hospitales, de las escuelas, de todo lo que ocurre en la ciudad, que descarga el agua en el drenaje profundo, viene a dar por aquí. Salen incluso pedazos de humanos, a veces de los hospitales, desechos, alguno que otro feto pasa por aquí, perros muertos.
It goes into the northeast where people grow crops that later on are sold in the Mexico City market. So we are being poisoned. Our wastewater is returning to us in the form of food. When you look into the rivers, you can see bubbles. That means that the rivers are losing oxygen.
Contamination and pollution of the water systems is creating cholera, and water diseases are killing more children today than malaria or AIDS or even wars themselves.
What we now know is that we are polluting and depleting this finite stock of fresh water so fast that we're now mining the groundwater faster than it can be replenished.
It rains. The water hits the ground and percolates into the soil, collecting underground into what are known as aquifers or groundwater. But how much of our finite supply of water is underground? We can only estimate, as there is no reliable method to accurately measure, which is why our growing dependency on groundwater is such an urgent concern.
The fabled Atlantis in the Middle East had a real city attached to it. It was called Ubar. It disappeared and no one could figure out what happened. And then some archaeologists found it. And what they realized is it collapsed into the desert sand from groundwater pumping. Not only could it happen, it is happening today in Florida. Giant sinkholes have emerged, all of a sudden just big cavities in the ground opening up.
The effects are not always evident, as with a sinkhole or lost city. Entire regions can slowly and evenly sink as a watershed is depleted.
Perfect example is where Mexico City is now. There was once an oasis of water. When the Spanish came, they didn't want their new city to look like Venice. They wanted it to look like Madrid. And they used slave labor to cut down all the trees that would protect the water sources and to dredge the water systems. And what happened was that they just destroyed the water table. And of course, that was one thing when there were 10,000 people living there. It's another when there are, maybe 25 million. They've taken the rest of the water underneath the city. The city is literally sinking in on itself, and these great big churches are beginning to, go sideways. And Mexico is having to go further and further and further away from its local water sources, because there aren't any left, to find water.
Human ingenuity has found out ways to get water from beneath the surface of the earth for thousands of years. What's changed, though, is the technology. We now pump approximately 30 billion gallons of groundwater every day. The farming community started tapping into our aquifers at a time when there really were not other demands on the resource. The way that the law works is that they're allowed to use limitless quantities. And then the added kicker is that the law said, if you don't use it, if you don't divert all of this water, you may lose your water right.
When we pump water for such irrigation, some of it percolates back into the ground, which is called recharge or return flows. So long as we pump no more than what is recharged, we are using the groundwater sustainably. The problem is that we're pumping up to 15 times more water from the ground than is returning back into it, creating a global crisis.
One thing that most people don't know is that the world is desertifying very quickly. We are becoming a desert in many places.
Our soil is eroding, simply meaning that overgrazing, winds, and flooding damage the top layer of Earth, essentially hardening it to the point that rainwater cannot easily soak into the ground. Our life source literally slips away from us, back into the ocean through sewers and rivers, draining the land of its moisture and life. Tree roots absorb water and thus hold the watershed in place. When they leave the land, so does the water.
Because the forests that held the water have all been logged, there is no place where the water can be stored. The rain still comes and runs away as instant surface.
But groundwater pumping cannot alone be blamed for our desertification crisis.
Cities are growing and expanding. For the first time in human history, more people living in cities than in the countryside.
We have replaced permeable ground with hardscape, with roofs, with parking lots, with homes.
Clearly, there is much more unpaved than paved land in the world, but the effect is cumulative and should not be underestimated.
celosvetovo zhruba 750 miliard kubíkov vody. Tento proces sa odštartoval po druhej svetovej vojne. Dá sa povedať, že teraz sme v polčase rozpadu vodného cyklu a o 50 rokov bude vlastne definitívny kolaps s vodnými zdrojami na globálnej úrovni.
There is another problem with increased urbanization, which is our continued insistence to build housing for growing populations that demand more water than local watersheds can provide. Instead of adapting our development to the available water supply of a region, we choose to force the world's water supply to adapt to our desired locations.
What dams do is change the hydrologic cycle. They provide water during those months when the natural flow patterns do not.
What's happened is that we built these huge hydro dams mainly to create hydropower and hydroelectricity. And when we've done that, we've done it in a very narrow framework. And we haven't thought about the fact that we're going to need water for other purposes.
In this quest to conquer nature, as some label it, we've constructed close to 50,000 large dams worldwide. But if we are headed towards desertification by allowing too much rainwater to run off into the sea, then is it not to our benefit to dam water and prevent it from reaching the sea?
One of the basic functions of rivers is to carry stuff from one place to another. And that stuff, which is really critical to the health of an entire watershed, it becomes completely and wholly interrupted when you build a dam.
Dammed rivers fail to carry such nutrients and minerals downstream through the watershed, resulting in more soil erosion, less percolation when it rains, more runoff, and thus an increase in the desertification problem.
When you trap water, it stops moving, and when it stops moving, it heats up because it's this nice warm soup full of nutrients that are not making it downstream. But then those things die, and then they eat up oxygen. All of a sudden, you've got a major water quality problem.
A river is the lifeblood of an ecosystem, just like the veins and arteries bring blood to every part of our organism. When we have choked arteries, that's what's called a heart attack. A dam is the choking of the artery of the planet.
So we really have to face the crisis here that what we were taught in school, that this finite amount of water could never run out, is technically true. But if you can't access it because you took it from an aquifer and you poured it into a desert to grow cotton, or you polluted it, it's of no use to us. And that's what we need to get into our heads. And there's nowhere to go in the world to get away from this. But the world water crisis will face us all. But if there is going to be one single thing that is going to slam us into reality, it is going to be running out of water.
We see all sorts of fresh water in our lakes and say, well, you know, what's the problem? We've got lots of fresh water. Once you drain a lake, that's it. There is no more water. We have to start focusing in on what is the renewable supply which comes through the hydrologic cycle. We are creating a situation where we have less and less of that renewable supply left. And with the help of water scientists, we have to really start to assess how much water we really do have to work with. What is that renewable supply, and trying to define it. That's the task at hand. We must be able to find out what the limits are and how to live within them.
But instead of our governments coming together and saying, we have a limited amount of time to come together and find the solution, what they've done is they've handed power over to big water companies who want to create a kind of water cartel.
What if corporations plan to control the world by controlling its water? Here's where it gets crazy. As conspiracies go, the idea of a global water cabal is frightening stuff, primarily because there's so much uncertainty around the future of Earth's water supply. Yet the debate quickly descends into murky territory. First, there's evidence that state-run water systems can be extremely corrupt, especially in poor countries. Second, there's widespread distrust of privatization. In many cases, developing countries do not have a choice in the matter. The World Bank and International Monetary Fund have often only assisted debtor nations if they agree to privatize public utilities, including water. These demands are attached as conditions to crucial loans.
So that one day, every single drop of fresh water in the world will be privately owned and controlled.
Up until the 1980s, really, if water was privatized, they were companies within a country. So France was mostly privatized, but the companies that then became the giants were just French companies delivering water locally. And then in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher came to power, and the Thatcher Revolution came into effect, and she privatized all the water in Great Britain. And that's when these big companies decided that they could start going global. At the same time, the UN was beginning to explore the language of water as an economic good and a commodity. And the very first time was at a very important conference in Dublin in 1992, which for the first time named water as a good. So you've got the companies all ready to go because they've been delivering inside nation states. And now you've got the UN saying, okay, we're ready to start thinking about water differently. It's not a right. So it all kind of converged together. Well, the World Bank is created after the Second World War to bring financial stability and development to the developing world. And it's supposed to be pooled money from the wealthier countries to help develop the global south. However, what's happened is that the World Bank has hooked up with the three big water private service companies in Europe. They basically started to work their way into the developing world. And the World Bank would say, in exchange for debt relief, now we want you to privatize water. And this became an enormously important symbol. These trade rules are not some dry academic thing on a piece of paper. These are rules that affect people's lives, and these are rules that are killing people. This is the new colonialism. It doesn't come in ships.
For example, in Cochabamba, Bolivia, the World Bank forced the government to privatize its water supply, handing control of the system to two private companies. The price of water skyrocketed, and the impoverished population could not afford the rate hike. In 2000, the people of Cochabamba took to the streets. Their protest eventually led to repeal of the privatization law, and this was only the first of several water-related conflicts in Bolivia. Yet more than a decade later, many residents still do not have adequate access to drinking water. And supporters of privatization note that it has net beneficial effects, particularly in the reduction of child mortality. Critics note that private entities like Suez, Veolia, Thames, Sur, and other groups focus on profits rather than on public good, and experts on both sides of the debate agree that privatization, when done incorrectly, can be disastrous. It's no secret that water, if treated as a product, could be incredibly profitable. After all, no human being can live without it, and current laws allow water companies to buy large tracts of land only to siphon the water and sell it somewhere else.
We've heard the facts at this meeting. We've heard about the underachievement and the failures of privatization. And we know that ultimately these corporations aren't accountable to the communities that they serve. They're accountable to their shareholders, and nothing's going to change that.
People think that water privatization is just a problem in the global south and the developing world, but that's just simply not the case. We have the very same situation in the U.S. You're using water from an ecosystem in Northern California, transporting it through long pipes and canals to Southern California.
It's Southern California. And LA is part of what I call hydraulic civilizations, like Rome and its aqueducts was a hydraulic civilization. But there, the longest aqueduct was 60 miles. The longest you have to go, once measured it, is 1,400 miles from the furthest source of water for LA to a home in the town. And LA has not yet figured out what its limit should be. I mean, it doesn't want a limit. In the LA area itself, which is about 18 million, if it was on its own water, it would only be 3 million. First thing LA is going to do is try to put a lot of farmers out of work and close down the farms and take that water. When the water system doesn't work, then the civilization goes.
So we've set up this system of agriculture that just doesn't work anymore, and it's really based on the concept of virtual water.
The most famous conflict occurred in the Owens Valley, and Mulholland was the head of the water department there, and noticed that it was pretty much a downhill run to LA in the 1920s. And so he got together a whole bunch of investors to divert all the water from Mono Lake and send it down through an aqueduct to LA. It put the farmers out of business. And there was a big, violent rebellion. In 2 different instances, tried to blow up the aqueduct. They partially succeeded once, and then they were arrested, and then they sent in kind of goon squads to get rid of the farmers, and then they paid them off. When Arizona sent in the National Guard, because California, again, was building a dam across the Colorado to divert the water to California without giving Arizona any. But it led to the Secretary of the Interior to stop the dam.
As Americans, our property rights matter. Land, buildings, and material goods are the means by which we live. Without rights over our property, we have no rights over our very means of survival, and therefore we are no longer free. Our founding fathers knew this and declared our rights unalienable, meaning no person could ever take them away. So critical are property rights that our Constitution protects them in the Fifth Amendment. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Individual rights and freedoms are 2 elements that make America exceptional. Not all nations think that way. Our Constitution says that man's rights are inherent to his nature as a man, and as such are unalienable. This is in direct opposition to the UN Declaration, which holds that man's rights are granted by other men and therefore can be taken away by men. Our common future. It is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This sounds fine, until you read the report. It states, poverty is a major cause and effect of global environmental problems. It then blames nations like the United States for consuming too much and having too much wealth, much of it in the form of private property. The report concludes the only way to make the future sustainable is to reduce America's living standards and transfer our wealth to developing nations. Sustainable Development's political agenda originates in the UN's founding documents. This is not surprising, since many of the nations represented needed a point of agreement to rally around. The UN Charter provided that. Whereas our Declaration of Independence protects our citizens and their labor, the UN Declaration grants government the authority to withhold your property for the good of the community. To implement sustainable development in the United States, unalienable rights such as the right to property must be eroded or struck down altogether.
Why do I say that? Because they're also going after rainwater. Yes, they've arrested a man in Oregon on the basis that he cannot collect his own rainwater. Sound incredible? It's true. Today, Jackson County, Oregon says it's your rainwater, and the country has sentenced a man to 30 days in jail and fined him $1,500 for the supposed crime of collecting rainwater on his own property. On that land, he has 3 ponds, and those ponds collect rainwater that fall on his land. Common sense would say he has every right to the ponds with the water on his property, but common sense has been all but abandoned. And here they are arguing that once it heads towards natural waterways, it's no longer your water, no longer the Earth's water, but the government's water. But the issue is, in fact, bigger than that. But I would point out, this has been in the media for over a week. I've heard the audio commentary from this guy, Harrington, and he's quoted in part as saying, when something's wrong, you just as an American citizen have to put your foot down and say, this is wrong. You can't just take away any more of my rights from here on in. I'm going to fight it. As you well know, they're going after everything from backyard gardens to lemonade stands, raw milk, Amish growers, Amish dairy people, you name it. They're coming after individualism in this country because they're pushing collectivism. Now, according to Oregon laws, one must obtain a permit in order to have a reservoir. But Harrington had the permits for the reservoir. In 2003, he was granted the permits, but the state reversed the decision, then come along to seize his rights to collect water, and now we're putting him in jail, which he's basically going along with as an act of civil disobedience, as an act of saying if you're going to be a tyrant, then you be a tyrant, as a Henry David Thoreau move of saying the best place in an unnatural state, in a corrupt state, is in prison, because that's the only place for a righteous man. Bad paraphrase of that quote, but it's on the record. But why is this a bigger issue than just rainwater collecting in Oregon? Well, it's because since at least 2010, they've been doing it throughout the Southwest, many western states. In this previous article, collecting rainwater now illegal in many states as big government claims ownership over water. Another Mike Adams article. He points out how many western states, including Utah, Washington, and Colorado, have outlawed individuals from collecting rainwater, calling it an unlawful diversion of rainwater. What turning of natural rights, of common sense, all on its head, and claiming that government has the default rights to something that comes naturally on the earth instead of an individual. That's the reverse of the way the Constitution was written and understood, where all rights are kept to the people and to the states, except those very few that are enumerated and specifically given to the limited federal centralized government. All that has turned around over these centuries, and now collectivist big government assumes the right until you're proven innocent, until you're proven to have some kind of individual right for something as necessary and basic to survival as water. But it just freaks me out that they could tell us we can't even collect rainwater on our own property. Total invasion of property rights. So you can see whether it's privatization where they want a monopoly of profits or the state where they want a monopoly of power, they're not interested in individuals having an alternative, in this case to rainwater, because it cuts into their domination.
Government controlling a lot of stuff. I've been in government. I worked in the federal government, I worked in state government, I worked in local government, and I see an extraordinary amount of corruption. Right now, we have a number of state senators that have just been indicted in Alaska for corruption, dealing with the oil industry. But what was the amount of corruption? A few $1,000s. It's not the money, it's the power.
The largest water concession given by the government in the whole country was to a Coca-Cola bottling plant. It takes as much water as it wants. You could say that Coca-Cola ruled Mexico.
If you really look at the controversy of whether water should be owned privately or water should be owned publicly, I see abuses on both sides. When water is only owned by the government, you have an opportunity for abuse. When water is jointly owned by someone who is a capital interest, a private interest, a profit interest, and government, you have a partnership that tends to balance those things out.
The new face of colonialism comes in the form of Coca-Cola. You walk anywhere in Africa and it's Coca-Cola water. You cannot get anything but, you cannot drink the water out of the tap. You can't even find purifiers. You are an absolute slave to this company.
Dasani is not meant to be a substitute for municipal supply, so we are absolutely in support of robust, comprehensible, and equitable water and sanitation systems.
In this country, you have to pay more for this water than you pay for the same amount of Coca-Cola. So that's something.
I think Wall Street per se understands in 50 years this is the commodity to be invested in. There's a sunset out there, there's a horizon out there that's coming closer and closer for oil, but not for water.
There are at least a dozen publicly traded water indexes that deal only with water, trading it on the open stock market. 5 years ago, this didn't exist. Now it's just simply exploding.
It takes two players to really make the corruption happen. First of all, we have corporations who are often greedy, but corporations are not social service agencies. They're there to make a profit. And what happens too often is that the water hunters are able to come in and either the government is corrupt or the laws are not sufficient to protect the water resources.
As a water hunter, you just go out and you try to find a water source. It's not going to cost you a lot of money to clean up. The problem is getting it and holding on to it. Canada had 12 contracts for bulk export of water and arbitrarily, with the change of government in British Columbia, canceled those contracts. When you have a change in government, the previous government's commitments are subject to renegotiation, and that's just the way it is. So when you're looking at water owned by someone else that you have to get a contract with, that's not a secure commodity anymore. The only way to have a secure commodity is to create it yourself by desalination.
Many do not see the harm in depending on desalination for our future water needs.
And suddenly, many countries in the world are looking to desal and building new desal plants as the alternative, and this is going to save them.
But to do that, we require a great deal of fossil fuels and burning of fossil fuels, which contributes to global warming, which in turn contributes to the climate change problem in general. In order to address one problem, we end up creating a new problem.
We already have an energy shortage. Where are we going to get the energy to use desalination? And a lot of corporations are saying nuclear technologies. Well, nuclear technologies are really not viable. We have no current plan to deal with nuclear waste.
The fact that there aren't more plants in the world is because it's a cost factor.
Only rich countries or the World Bank or big corporations or a combination of all three are going to be able to afford to build desalination plants.
But even on the slim chance that technology can advance quickly enough, that the energy costs and needs lower enough to make a global desalination solution possible, the question still remains, why? Why forfeit the water we already currently have? Why freely give it to others only so they can sell it back to us at whatever cost the demand allows?
When you have communities that are looking to extend their water supplies, they'll pay what they feel the value of that supply is worth.
There are 87 corporations now building desalination plants, and the biggest water company of all is General Electric, followed by Procter & Gamble and Dow Chemicals getting into it. These are all companies that have seen the writing on the wall. And the writing on the wall is that water is the hottest property out there.
I think you can add a 15% on that. I think if 15% is responsible, some investors will require 30. And if you can't offer 30, they're not interested in investing.
What we actually have is that these big corporations are going to profit from dirty water. So they don't want to see the pollutants not going into the water in the first place. They want to have a model where they can step in and provide very expensive technologies to clean up pollution after it occurs.
I wondered when I looked at the UN Millennium Goals why they didn't include goals around pollution and cracking down on the fact that if you can't use the rivers and lakes in your area, then you're forced to mine groundwater. Well, it's as clear as a bell to me now. It's because they're raking in the money. Who's going to own that water? When General Electric has it to clean, does it pass through them but still belong to the public? I don't think so.
So it becomes a product that is a result of your process, and then you own it.
Who ends up owning these desal plants? Because if these desal plants are in private hands or even in government hands, because after all, water is the source of life. If these desal plants are the way in which we get access to water, then those desal plants and who owns them ends up controlling our lives.
In our legal framework, corporations have the same rights as citizens, and so we see Nestle having the ability to go in and pump.
So this is a new development that's taking place as more and more of us move into big cities and don't want to think about where water comes from. Increasingly, it's coming from the places that grow your food. This is really, really, really short-sighted.
We massively ship water out of an area, the ecosystem is disrupted. The natural habitat damaged, biodiversity reduced, and aquifers dried. The water-rich area we chose to export from will itself desertify. The thirsty populations in the water-poor deserts we ship water to will simply consume the water and send it back to the sea via its sewers, thus still remaining a desert. Where one desert region existed before, two deserts now exist.
For instance, here in Kenya, they grow most of the roses that are sold in Europe, and they export them. And they're grown around a beautiful, beautiful lake called Lake Naivasha, which is being depleted at an appalling rate.
All done by foreign corporations, huge, great big flower plantations. If they keep doing this, within 5 years it will be a putrid puddle. So here's one of the driest continents on Earth, exporting water, being told by the World Bank to export its water to get its way out of debt. Now I call this form of murder.
You don't know when the water would flow. It flows once a week, and you don't know the date, the time, so you are forced to open up the tap. When they open their taps, it's air, and when the air blows through the taps, the meters are running, and they are charged for doing this.
There's a pipe coming up, and between the pipe and the tap, there's a water meter, and you have to pay for an electronic key to get charged up. And you can look at it and you can see the water meter counting every single drop. And as one friend of mine said, I can afford about 2 flushes a month from this thing. That's how expensive it is. You know, they just throw their hands up in despair and they go back to that river that has cholera warning signs on it.
If people don't have money to buy water, they go to polluted streams, they get sick. The state has to pay for their health care. You know, why don't you just use money for the necessary thing and to prevent other things that might come up? If in the house I'm the only one employed and I buy water, I'm going to limit or ration the people who are living in that house. That's why then you get domestic violence. Because now I want to do my laundry, but because my sister is the only one employed, she determines when I do my laundry. You know, parents will take the tokens that they use into making sure that the water can run, you know, wherever they go, maybe to work and all that. And then during the day, kids don't have water. And this other woman who lived in a shack with 2 kids took the token and went with it to work. And the shack caught fire. And there was no water to stop the fire. And even the neighbors are saying, we don't have money to stop hair fire, you know? These projects are taking away our humaneness.
You do a charity project each year at our school. You do your canned food drives, you raise money for cancer. That year, you're raising money for developing countries. And then she got to a point where she said $70 would buy a well. And then she explained to us, yeah, people are dying because they don't have clean water.
They were just disbelieving that. What do you mean? You can get sick from water and that you don't have things to clean yourself with, let alone drink the water.
Then we asked, well, if they want water, how far would they have to go? And she said, like, sometimes as far as 10,000 steps. The Ryan's Well Foundation has been established. We've helped raise about $2 million, which has gone towards the completion of 266 water and sanitation projects, helping about 500,000 people.
Immediate aid like this is absolutely vital to saving lives. But if we step back, a larger question looms. An uncomfortable question we habitually avoid in our daily discussions. Why do these countries need emergency aid to provide something as basic as water? Why are they unable to build their own infrastructure of clean water delivery? Why are they poor?
The World Trade Organization has required developing countries to remove tariffs so that products can flow in and out of the country because it benefits our corporations. They get cheap products. Now what that means is that developing countries are very hurt.
And it's obscene. It's why these countries can't get out of debt, and it's why these countries can't develop water systems or healthcare or anything else for their kids. And there's a famous Senate hearing where a very senior World Bank official told the US Senate, don't worry, we're not giving money away, particularly for every dollar the United States invests in the developing world through the World Bank. American corporations get back $1.30. You know, wink, wink. We call it aid, development aid, but really it's forcing countries to open up their resources, and that's why there's such a tremendous reaction against the World Bank in the third world.
It should be a very rich country.
We cannot fight the world water crisis by just saying, let's hook up some more people and hope that does it. We have to challenge the systems that deliberately create winners from losers. And then who cares about the losers? That they're losers, and it's their own fault anyway. That's the system we have to take on, and we will never, 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 never solve the world water crisis until we have the courage to talk about the world political and economic system.
Wherever a river flowing free is now treated as the supplier of raw material as if it was oil. We have the generation of water wars.
Foreign hackers have launched a cyber attack on the water supply of Illinois state capital Springfield. WMAQ has more.
Russian cyber hackers may be to blame for an attack on a water plant there. Workers say they noticed glitches over the past 2 months before the water pump burned out. They determined their computers had been hacked. Homeland Security now investigating. It could be the first cyber attack on an American water supply.
The full motive for the attacks is still unclear, but the Daily Mail writes that this method seems similar to one cyber attackers used in China. The method used, hacking a security company to gain entry to another company, was employed earlier this year by cyber attackers in China. They stole data from RSA, a division of EMC that provides secure remote computer access to government agencies. Security experts say the attacks show just how vulnerable companies and utilities are. Still, the Department of Homeland Security is hesitant to point the finger at Russia. A writer for Digital Trends says finding out who did it isn't as easy as finding an IP address. The attack appears to have been launched from an IP address located in Russia, though it's possible that the hacker or hackers who waged the attack are physically located elsewhere and simply waged a proxy attack to make it appear as though Russia was the base of operations.
The Chinese, the symbol for water, not only means water, it means control, which I think is quite profound in the sense that controlling water is everything.
And the word rivals, for instance, comes from Latin meaning river. The rivals were people standing on either side of the river throwing things at each other.
And you're just going to see more of that as the technology develops to be able to suck water out of the atmosphere. Now you're going to find water from the atmosphere and clouds being stolen.
New techniques for controlling the weather are being tried. When conditions are right, rain is made to fall by seeding clouds with dry ice or silver iodide.
It's happening in China and some other places where a particular village pays for a plane to go up. They make it rain before the cloud gets to the next village. So there's real anger and real political tension.
One of the most bloody water wars is still being fought over the river Kaveri, that farmers of Karnataka and farmers of Tamil Nadu both required more water out of that river. A bandit of Tamil origin, Veerappan, kidnapped a Karnataka actor with the demand that large amounts of water be released to Tamil Nadu. It was really as a chess game in the water wars. I was doing a major study on conflicts over resources for the United Nations University. This fat file of mine on river water conflicts suddenly had no more coverage because the entire issue was now being presented as an issue of religion, not water demands and water conflicts. So many water wars are presented as religious conflicts, when in reality they are fundamental conflicts over resources.
We're going to see a whole new geopolitical picture emerging here where the world map will be rewritten and redesigned. They've already mapped out what are going to be the most intense areas of potential conflict in the next 10, 15, and 20 years.
This map shows the UN's vision for our country's land use when sustainable development is fully implemented. The black areas are where humans will be permitted to live. Sustainable development is a plan for global control using land and resource restriction, social transformation through education, and other programs. The land use element of sustainable development calls for 2 action plans designed to reduce or eliminate private property: the Wildlands Project and Smart Growth. Upon implementation, all human action is subject to control. Since all things ultimately come from natural resources on rural lands, the transfer of the land from citizen to government control will make it easy for government and its partners to control what we have, what we do, and where we go. The rural land use embodied in the Wildlands Project is tied to its urban counterpart, Smart Growth. As human beings are barred from rural land, there will be a concentration of human activity in urban areas. Through Smart Growth, the infrastructure is being created for a post-private property era in which human action is subject to the centralized government planning. Sometimes called comprehensive planning or growth management, smart growth is the centralized control of every aspect of urban life, including energy and water use, housing, population growth and control, public health and dietary regimens, resources and recycling, social justice and education, toxic technology and waste management, transportation and air quality, business, and economic activity.
So the water-rich areas of the world are Brazil, Canada, Russia.
So these big superpowers are beginning to position themselves in such a way that water, like energy, is seen as part of their future security, including their military security, including their commercial security. And they're beginning to understand they have to secure future sources of water.
In the new regime, where water is being treated like oil, the protection of that commodity is being ensured through a militarized defense.
And the good part of Brazil sits over top of the largest aquifer in the world, which is called the Guarani Aquifer. This is going to be a major source of fresh water in the future. I mean, there's no question that that region of the world is the Middle East of water in the future.
But even without ominous rumors, this situation looks bleak. Who will control the world's water? Will nation-states work together to ensure water supplies for future generations? Will privatization pave the way for water security in developing countries, as its defenders argue? Or are these companies pursuing water with an entirely different goal in mind?
To call for a United Nations Convention that explicitly states that water is a human right and a public trust that must not be denied to anyone on the basis of inability to pay.
Demanding that we put this language in an international framework at the United Nations.
Because the operations of these corporations, these water barons, have now gone global, this has gone beyond nation-state law and requires us to bring in some kind of instrument at an international level to control these companies.
Where citizens were able to pass a constitutional amendment that actually established the right to water and forbids privatization.
That's the model that we've been using when we talk to groups around the world, and the model that we're promoting.
So we're looking for a small group of nations to begin a process within the process in the United Nations. There are some powerful countries opposing the right to water, most prominently the United States. To my eternal shame, my own country, Canada.
Well, I want to tell you about one country tonight, and that's the country of Bolivia, South America's poorest country. Several years ago, the World Bank refused to guarantee a $25 million loan to finance the investment program of the local water co-op and forced Bolivia to sell its water systems to a subsidiary of Bechtel. The water prices now account in Bolivia for more than they pay for food.
As environmentalist Vandana Shiva points out, the world's poor, those who need the most help accessing clean water, are simply not a profitable enough market for private concerns. Shiva also argues that private corporations are buying up the world's water at an accelerated rate, and that this process will disenfranchise the world's poor.
Obrero industrial, y cuando en Bolivia se privatizó el agua, la gente, nosotros no podíamos concebir que un empresario privado, un inversionista transnacional, podía apropiarse del agua. Es decir, la gente o tenía que pagar del agua o tenía que dejar de comer y por lo tanto no tuvo otra alternativa que decir no a la privatización del agua. Una rebelión popular, una forma organizativa de multitudes de gente, que desde los campesinos hasta los vendedores de las calles, y empezamos una resistencia. El gobierno sacó al ejército y a la policía para garantizar la seguridad jurídica de la empresa, garantizar las utilidades y las ganancias de la compañía.
But it's really interesting because, you know, the World Bank has imposed the same kind of private control and takeover of many other things in developing countries. Healthcare, education, their energy sector, their mines, and so on. But when it comes to water, something happens and people say, I couldn't stop you there, or I didn't know how, or I thought maybe you would be right, but you are not taking my local water.
Asociados de una abierta complicidad de los gobernantes en ese tiempo en Bolivia, que inclusive se privatizó el agua de la lluvia, es decir, que se prohibía a la gente el acumular el agua de la lluvia.
And this is where you get the civil wars, because the army is brought in to control local dissent against these transnational corporations. Who are you protecting? There's your people without drinking water, and you're protecting foreign investors from North America and Europe?
Más de 100 heridos de bala, numerosos detenidos. Civil, hubieron más de 20 francotiradores que mataron e hirieron a la gente.
17-year-old Victor Hugo Doza was killed by a shot through his face.
The water wars. The recent visions of the tsunami rushing, raging, tearing through the Asian coasts has given us all some interesting insights into the truly stunning and indeed awesome power of water and how nature's fury is virtually boundless when unleashed. Yet there is another watery war that is being waged that may affect the lives of billions, but it garners neither the concern nor really the attention of the world's media. The electronic media, especially, thrives on drama and conflict and seeks pictures and stories which reflect those features. It also affirms the positions of the privileged as opposed to the plight of the poor and powerless. Yet all across the globe, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and even here in North America, people are living under the very real threat of the corporatization of water and water systems. The waters of the earth, which have been since the dawn of human civilization for the collective usage of the community, is fast becoming just another commodity, something to sell. If you can afford it, cool. If not, tough. Michael Stark, a senior executive at U.S. Filter, a subsidiary of the multinational corporation Vivendi, put it this way: water is a critical and necessary ingredient to the daily life of every human being, and it is also an equally powerful ingredient for powerful manufacturing companies. Veronica Lake, a Michigan-based environmental activist, has noted that corporations acquire the world's water by three major methods. A, by water mining the underground aquifers or deep sources of many of the world's streams or rivers. B, by leasing state and government water systems and collecting revenues. And C, by managing city water systems. In short, there's money in water, and where money is, there too are corporations trying to get paid. That's the dark, unforeseen, and treacherous side of the globalization movement among Western governments and corporations. That's also what privatization really means, taking the common inheritance of nature and making it into someone else's private property. In South Africa, this movement has resulted in more misery for the poor. Indeed, cholera rates are higher now there than in the days of apartheid. It's often the result of tough austerity measures imposed by the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, where governments are privatizing essential services, and the cost of living now means the right to buy water to live. Nor is this merely a story for the distant third world. In Detroit, Michigan today, some 40,000 people on the southwest side have had their water shut off for non-payment. In many older buildings, water isn't just the stuff that's supposed to run through faucets. It also provides steam heat through old radiators. So, no water means no heat. In Detroit, scholars say that the next world wars will be fought not for oil, but for water, for it is infinitely more precious. Thankfully, people all over the world, in South Africa, in Ploshimada, India, in Bolivia, in Brazil, in France, Ghana, and Canada, are fighting both their sellout governments and the corporations for the human right of free access to water. Those of you who have heard my earlier pieces may remember the Bolivian water wars in a place called Cochabamba. There, a popular group calling itself La Coordinadora de Defensa del Agua y de la Vida, the Defense Committee in Defense of Water and Life, organized the poor, the homeless, the streetwalkers, and everyone they could to oppose the corporatization of their water. They ran out the Bechtel Corporation. It must spread, or else water will become as rare as gold and as expensive.